The files are open, the evidence is on the table, and I'm Anna.
I'm Destiny.
Now I'm Mark.
And this is Feral and Fatal. Tonight, we are discussing a case that has completely taken over Greene County. Depending on who you talk to, it's either a tragic case of a woman experiencing a mental health crisis or a case where people believe important questions were never fully answered. Today, we are talking about Jessica Paige Kemp. Now, before we get into what happened, I need you to understand something. By the end of the episode, we're not going to tell you who did anything because honestly, the biggest thing I found while going through hundreds of pages of records is that nobody seems to agree on what happened.
Those are always the frustrating cases.
Exactly. So on May 5th, Jessica is camping near Lake Ashball in Greene County, Arkansas. And that morning, she calls 911. Not because she's hurt, not because she's lost. She calls because she says someone is trapped underneath her vehicle.
Hold on. Under the vehicle?
Yeah. She tells dispatch she can hear somebody screaming for help. She believes there's a person under her car. Deputies respond, and this is where things start going in two different directions. One side of the story says Jessica was suffering from hallucinations and was experiencing a mental health and drug related crisis. And to be fair, there are documents later showing methamphetamine in her system. There are multiple reports of behavior that would support that theory. But here's where people start asking questions. A few days later, Jessica is gone.
So someone reported her missing.
Yes. And what deputies find at the campsite is strange. The tent is still standing, clothes are there, personal belongings are there, food is there. Her campsite doesn't look like somebody packed up and left. But depending on which document you're reading, people describe the scene differently. Some say it looked abandoned, others say it looked ransacked. And then we get to Johnny.
Something told me there was going to be a Johnny.
Yeah, and there's always a Johnny. And before anybody gets upset, we're not accusing Johnny of anything. But Johnny becomes one of the most discussed people in this case because he was one of the last known people around Jessica. And investigators themselves documented concerns about parts of this timeline.
Oh shit. What kind of concerns?
Well, that's where it gets weird because at one point, Johnny says he hadn't been back to the campsite after leaving. But then there are statements and evidence that appear to place him during the events he says he wasn't presented for. And this is where investigators start paying close attention to Johnny's statements. Later statements seem to create questions about the extent of that relationship and how well they actually knew each other. And then there's another detail. When deputies arrived at the campsite after Jessica's disappearance, reports indicate Johnny was going through Jessica's vehicle while looking for her. According to those reports, he told deputies that he was looking for Jessica and referred to her as his friend.
Why does that matter?
Because family members and some followers of this case point to something else. Jessica didn't commonly go by Jessica. According to people who knew her, she typically used her middle name in everyday life. So some people have questioned how well Johnny actually knew her, while others argue that knowing her legal first name isn't unusual if they have previously spent time together.
So, once again, we're left with two competing interpretations.
Exactly. One interpretation is that Johnny simply knew Jessica and was concerned when she disappeared. The other interpretation is that some of the statements and timeline don't fit together as neatly as they first appeared. And that's one of the reasons investigators themselves documented concerns about inconsistencies in portions of the timeline. And then investigators discover something else, a Facebook live video. Johnny goes live from a campsite. Later, that video is deleted. And to be specific, it was 2 days later he deleted it. But somebody had already preserved it and turned it over to the investigators. Now, Jessica is never actually seen in the video, but people believe that you can hear her in the background. And depending on who you ask, that's either completely normal or one of the most important pieces of evidence in that case. So I will take a moment and I will let you listen to the video yourselves and make sure you put your earbuds in. It's quite interesting.
So what the hell did the investigators say?
Well, that's part of the problem. The investigators eventually focuses heavily on the idea that Jessica was experiencing hallucinations, and some people believe that's exactly what happened. Others believe investigators became locked into that theory too early. Some of that they call, was it tunnel vision? But then there's another piece of evidence that keeps coming up when people discuss this case. Okay, well, what is that? DNA testing. Investigators also submitted biological evidence for laboratory testing. The lab reported an indication of male DNA. However, the sample was insufficient for advanced YSTR analysis. The report further noted that if investigators developed a suspect and wished to pursue additional testing, oral swabs could be obtained for comparison.
Oh, so they found male DNA, but just couldn't identify who it belonged to? Imagine that.
Yeah. And that's one of the questions people still debate. Some people look at that and say there simply wasn't enough DNA to take the testing any further. Others ask whether every possible forensic avenue was exhausted before the investigation was ultimately closed.
Especially considering all the questions.
And the questions just keep piling up. There were game cameras near where the remains were later discovered. There were issues involving missing footage just for the month of May for only 2 cameras. There were search efforts. There were family concerns. There were arguments about whether enough was done. And by the time remains were eventually located, the debate is bigger than ever.
So what was the official conclusion?
Even after the case was closed, Many of the questions weren't. And that's why people in Greene County are still talking about Jessica Kemp today. And now we get feral. So, everything we've talked about up to this point comes directly from reports, interviews, and evidence. These are simply our observations, questions, and opinions. In other words, don't sue us. Like, we're just talking at this point. We are not accusing anyone of anything. We are basically looking at evidence, files, everything that's documented. It is public. So, let's get into discussion. Yep, just conversating. Let's start with the 911 call. Deputy Tillman was there at scene. I believe it was within 3 minutes. She was still on the phone. She could see the lights. 911 hung up and he answered. He assisted. There was nobody under the vehicle. She was having hallucinations. She even said that she had stopped taking medication that she normally would take that would cause this. She wasn't distraught. She wasn't suicidal. There was no other issues going on at that time. EMS was called off because they were originally called to scene because they did think somebody was under the vehicle, but Deputy Tillman did not see anybody and called it off. And I mean, that's the gist of it. Yeah. I would say he went back the next day. And in his report, when I listened to it, he wasn't so much worried about Jessica. He was worried about the other camper that was there. And as he quoted, yeah, the deaf guy. Yeah, the deaf guy. He had a busted eardrum. Don't know how that happened, how it occurred, but he had a busted eardrum and he was more concerned about that. He went back the next day and talked to, quoted the deaf guy, aka Johnny Condre, didn't lay eyes on Jessica, wasn't worried about Jessica not being at her campsite, was just checking on Johnny, you know? I think he even did ask Johnny. He said, "Hey, have you seen Jessica?" And he's like, "No, I haven't seen her in a while." Okay, that's cool. Yeah.
So,
All right. Let's go deeper into the investigation and talk about the map. So, according to the map and according to documentation from the campsite, a mile and a half away, they found her remains. In between there, they found a backpack that belonged to her that was full of some belongings. After that, they found pants and underwear. And right after that, they found a torn bra. And then about a half a mile after that is where they found her remains past a pond. And the remains weren't pretty. So yeah, they were not pretty. This was actually my first time seeing this in crime documents. I knew what I was getting into. I wanted to learn more about the procedures of this case and get a better perspective on both sides. I will say that no, they were not pretty. I do not think any family should be able to see these things. They shouldn't have to go through it, and it's horrible. But sadly, it was a family that found the remains. They had assistance with the investigator, but they were the ones that discovered the clothing. Then after leading from one piece of clothing to the other, and they started smelling the decomposition, that's when they called for help. It definitely, I couldn't imagine what they felt in that moment.
she decomposed for 32 days, leaving nothing but bones. Her jawbone was separate from her body. There were three teeth, feet away from her, with the roots still intact. The police theory is she crossed the lake, was high on drugs, and passed on the bank. If you're ODing on meth, you're not going to be able to cross the river and then crawl up on the bank or anything. They found her in a fetal position. Rigor mortis had already set in. Rigor mortis sets in 2 to 6 hours, and it fully is established about 6 to 8 hours, but you can unrigor mortis after a day. It really depends on the environment.
And so then after rigor mortis, after that wears off, isn't it that the body just spreads out? There's no way that it could crawl back up into a fetal position.
Not at all.
So that theory, it really just doesn't support it. I can understand what it looks like, you know, from the outside. That's one theory you could go with, but there's no way with how you found those remains, how it was curled up, how that took place.
I mean, I'm not saying anything, but it almost looks as if like someone carried her there and laid her down in that position.
I think so too. You know, thinking about it, how far those clothes were apart, clothes where the underwear was found, and one pants leg.
I mean, I've never ran rampant through the woods and stripped my clothes, but I'm pretty sure if I did, my underwear probably wouldn't be stuck in the pants leg.
No, it wouldn't. I would do one piece at a time. But I've always put my clothes together.
Where's her shirt?
Yeah.
Where's her shoes? Was she just running for a mile and a half barefoot with no shirt on
Across the field.
Through woods
into
and
a
whatnot.
into a dirty ass pond? Like, what do you mean?
And it was nasty. This is on a private lease too.
And the game cameras just magically deleted the whole month of May? Like, what do you mean?
They would need to be looking.
Yeah, it's gated. It's a private lease. When I was looking into this, they do have game cameras. I think there was a total of 4. Out of the cameras, 2 of them that there was one facing toward the gate, and then there was one facing toward where you would see where Jessica's remains were in that area.
And how they got there?
Yeah, and how we got there. The whole month of May was missing. And then on the other 2 cameras, when I was looking at the files, the whole month was May was missing. However, they had an extra folder on each of them and had the month of May in them.
Out of order?
Yeah, it's weird. It's like okay, let's go back. Let's go get the month of May. Let's put it on here. But why wouldn't they be in order? Why would you create an extra folder? You know, why were they missing on the other 2? When I looked at the pictures on there, pest control coming through, maintenance with mowing, I saw how many times motion would go by with all the animals. A whole month on a high end hunting lake.
It wasn't just a month, it was 6 weeks.
Yeah, you're right. 6 weeks of missing camera footage. I don't see that happening.
You're going to know after a few days that your camera's not working.
I would think that they would keep track of that. Raises even more questions.
Someone knows something. There are people out there that knows. But unfortunately, the case is closed, and now we have all of these questions that will never be answered. I mean, if you know something, just come forward.
The evidence is there. The case is closed, but what happens now? Male DNA. All they need is 2 swabs of a suspect. That's all they need.
Well, sometimes the investigation is just too much and you give up and close the case.
I guess so.
We have a lot of respect for law enforcement. We understand that the job is very difficult. This has been difficult for us, just looking into cases that have already been closed. But you have to understand, like, the family needs some kind of closure. I mean, there's too many unanswered questions. Dig a little deeper. But anyway, case is closed. Rest in peace, Jessica Paige Kemp. Love, Feral and Fatal podcast.